Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the very architecture of human knowledge. We're going to look at how we structure, categorize, and really understand the act of learning itself. Whether you're a teacher building a curriculum, somebody trying to master a new skill, or honestly, just someone who loves learning, getting a grip on how knowledge is actually built is going to completely change how you approach new information.
Let's start with a really fundamental question. How do we actually measure learning? Think about it for a second. How can a teacher truly know if a student has actually absorbed new knowledge? Is it just, repeating facts on a test? Or is it something deeper, like taking that knowledge and applying it to a brand new problem out there in the real world? To figure this out, educators realized they needed a structured framework. Basically, they needed a map of the human mind at work.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover, first, the blueprint of learning. Second, cognitive, the thinking domain. Third, affective, the feeling domain. Fourth, psychomotor, the doing domain. Fifth, action verbs and objectives. And finally, number 6, critiques and real-world impact. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The Blueprint of Learning.
Back in 1948, the American Psychological Association started holding these conferences, and out of that, a committee of educators, led by a guy named Benjamin Bloom, set out to fix how curricula and exams were being designed. The result? Well, they published it in 1956, and it became known as Bloom's Taxonomy. The big takeaway here is that this taxonomy is kind of the ultimate blueprint. It takes educational goals and drops them into 3 distinct buckets, or domains: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. It literally gave educators around the world a universal language to build their lessons and assessments.
Moving on to Section 2. Cognitive, the thinking domain.
This brilliantly captures the cognitive domain. Look at this 3-dimensional model visualized as an apple. Now, the cognitive domain is all about intellectual skills, stuff like critical thinking and problem solving. But look at the layered, multidimensional nature of this graphic. On the outside, the skin, you've got your basic knowledge and comprehension. But as you cut deeper into the core of the apple, that's where you hit the higher-order thinking skills: application, analysis, evaluation, and eventually synthesis. It's like a physical object. You just can't reach the core without passing through the surface first. Now, what's really fascinating is how this framework evolved over time. In 2001, researchers Anderson and Krathwohl published a pretty massive revision. Check out the comparison here. The original 1956 version used static nouns, right? Knowledge, comprehension, application. But the 2001 revision flipped those to dynamic action verbs: remember, understand, apply. Because hey, learning is an active process, and the verbs really reflect that. Also, check out the top of the hierarchy. Evaluate and create actually swapped places. Creating, meaning taking ideas and putting them together to form a totally brand new whole, is now considered the absolute pinnacle of cognitive mastery.
All right, Section 3. Affective, the feeling domain.
This domain is all about growth in attitudes, emotions, and feelings, and it's mapped out in 5 specific steps. Let's walk through them using a great example from the source material about learning civil rights history. Step 1 is receiving. This is just basic awareness, like a student passively reading a chapter about civil rights. Step 2 is responding. Now the student is reacting, maybe answering questions in class or going out and reading another book by the same author. Step 3, valuing. Here, they're showing real commitment, like voluntarily attending a guest lecture on civil rights. Step 4 is organizing, where they integrate this value into their own priorities. Maybe they organize a civil rights rally on campus. And finally, Step 5, characterizing. This is where they act consistently with this new value, perhaps becoming a dedicated civil rights leader themselves. It's just a beautiful progression, going straight from passive awareness to core identity.
Next up, Section 4. Psychomotor, the doing domain.
Okay, before we break this one down, here's a really surprising piece of history. Bloom and his team back in the 50s, they never actually created subcategories for the psychomotor domain. They were just so hyper-focused on the cognitive side of things. It wasn't until years later that other educators, most notably Elizabeth Simpson in 1972, had to step in and actually map out the hierarchy for physical skills. So let's take a look at Elizabeth Simpson's scaffolding hierarchy for physical learning. It kicks off with perception, which is using your sensory cues, like closely watching a more experienced person do the task. Then comes set, which is your mental and physical readiness to act. Next up is guided response. These are the early stages, lots of imitation and, trial and error. As practice continues, we hit mechanism, where the movements actually become habitual. After that is complex overt response. That's performing a complex task accurately and with real skill. And finally, the top level,
Adaptation. This is the ability to modify those movements to fit entirely new, unexpected circumstances. So, from a beginner's clumsy first try all the way to an expert's effortless mastery, this is literally how we learn to do things. Which brings us to Section 5, Action Verbs and Objectives.
So how do we practically use this? The answer lies in action verbs. You see, instructors can't measure the inside of your brain, but they can measure what you do. Notice how specific, observable action verbs are mapped to each cognitive level here. If a teacher just wants to test if you remember something, they'll ask you to define or list it. But if they want to see if you can create, they're going to ask you to design or construct something. Using these specific verbs ensures that teachers are measuring exactly what they set out to teach. It totally takes the guesswork out of education.
And here's a peek behind the curtain at how those verbs fit into a teacher's daily life. When they're writing an instructional objective, they often use this specific formula. It starts with SWBAT, which is teacher shorthand for students will be able to. Then use, which introduces the target language or tool. Then to, and right here is where Bloom's action verbs plug in perfectly. Finally, in, which gives the context. So a full objective might look like this. Students will be able to use the past tense to compare historical events in a written essay. That one word, compare, tells everyone exactly where they are on Bloom's taxonomy.
Finally, Section 6, Critiques and Real-World Impact.
Now, let's look at this impartially, because the taxonomy does have its critics. Some experts really take issue with treating it as this strict sequential hierarchy. Check out this quote from Susan Lawler. She's talking about field taxonomy in biology. She notes that identifying and naming are at the lowest level of cognitive skills and have been systematically excluded from university degrees because they are considered simplistic. Her argument is that by viewing Bloom's as a strict ladder, educators might mistakenly dismiss those lower levels as unimportant. But I mean, in fields like natural history, the foundational skill of actually identifying a species is incredibly difficult, complex, and absolutely vital.
But on the flip side, the taxonomy's hierarchical structure has a very strong defense rooted in psychology. The core concept here is instructional scaffolding. It's an application of Vygotskian constructivism, which is just a fancy way of saying you build knowledge step by step. The reality is, you simply cannot evaluate or create something without first remembering and understanding the basics. Those lower-level skills, they aren't bad or too simple. They literally build the essential, non-negotiable foundation you need for higher-level mastery. You have to know the alphabet before you can write a profound novel, right?
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to turn the focus right back to you. We've explored how learning is mapped across thinking, feeling, and doing. Knowing this whole architecture, what would you say is your primary mode of learning? Do you need to intellectualize a concept first, connect with it emotionally, or do you just need to get your hands dirty and do it? Bloom's taxonomy shows us that true mastery probably involves all three. Keep this blueprint in mind the next time you set out to learn something brand new. It might just be the exact scaffolding you need to reach the top.